As of the time of me sitting down to record this, I've put in about 10 hours into Cyberpunk 2077, putting me at roughly a little less than halfway through the game, which in of itself tends to be about 18 to 20 hours long, if you're focusing mainly on doing the story missions. I don't think any of you watching this would be surprised when I say that 10 hours is only a small vertical slice of the total amount of time it would take to play this game to completion. I'm not personally a completionist in terms of how I play, but for this game, I do plan to play through almost all of the story content and probably a small chunk of the side missions and other optional content before putting out my full and final review video. I'm still planning on doing so, but since that'll take a fair bit of time, I thought I'd just put out a first impressions type video in the meantime. A review in progress, I suppose you could say. It might amuse you to note that the day Cyberpunk came out, I came down with a rather severe allergic reaction. That in of itself isn't amusing, but I've literally played through like half of this game with only partial visibility and my cat guarding my lap protectively. So while I know I'm far from being a great FPS player, I did good enough to survive in the futuristic dystopia that is 2077. You can put that on my grave. WarriorDan, he did good enough, him and his cat both. Fair warning, this video will contain a few spoilers for the early sections of the game, so if you've not played at least the first, 9 or 10 hours of Cyberpunk and don't want to be spoiled, just try not to read the subtitles popping up at the bottom of the screen. I generally prefer playing with subtitles on, and given how there's like a dozen different languages featured in this game, it kind of is necessary to use subtitles to understand what the hell is going on during any given conversation between characters. For my initial playthrough, I decided to check out the Street Kid setting. While the corporate experience looked promising, I really wanted to check out the full visual diversity of the world. For that very reason, I opted out of playing as a nomad because a lot of the background setting looked very generic and a tad too Mad Max inspired. Maybe it's just me, but I've never been too wowed by the Mad Max movies. Blasphemy, I know, but the idea of personally living out that fantasy for almost 30 hours didn't strike me personally as something worth committing to myself. First thing I want to talk about is the character creation process. Since Cyberpunk 2077, despite its combat and first-person perspective, still retains that crucial DNA of being a RPG game, one of them, of course, is a character creation and customization interface. The problem, though, with this one is, to put it bluntly, isn't all that great. I was really hoping that I'd be able to go crazy with my character design. Now, on the surface level, there are a lot of options to choose from, but it doesn't feel like many of them have a lot of depth to them. For instance, the hair and beard styles are fairly limited in variety. I myself, in real life, tend to possess a bit of an Obi-Wan hair and beard setup, which you would think would be easy to replicate in this kind of game, but Cyberpunk doesn't seem really that well equipped to allow me to show that off. Likewise, the number of available voices to pick from were ridiculously limited. You basically had one male and one female voice. And yes, for the initial laughs, I did briefly consider setting up my explicitly male character up with an overtly female voice. Not that there's anything wrong with that, of course, it's just that it would have been funny to have this very obviously masculine character have this pipsqueak feminine voice. Would have made for a funny contrast. But what can I say, I'm kind of the player that enjoys modeling a character sometimes after himself, and other times creating a character with the explicit purpose of making them look and feel as horrifyingly ridiculous as possible. I mean, the few times I've played Fallout, I'll create these ridiculous characters that look like they have no earthly relation to any real human. And that's the fun of an RPG, you're supposed to be able to create your perfect or imperfect character however you want to. And if this was any normal RPG game, you would be able to, but CDProjektRed kind of dropped the ball in that regard in this newest installment. I was kind of amused to see that Cyberpunk did go the Conan Exiles route of literally putting an in-game scaling option, allowing players to adjust their character's genital sizes more or less to whatever they want. Hey, do you want the biggest, stiffest, Viagra-infused log in human existence? You can do that. Do you want to look like you're actively suffering from a severe case of shrinkage? You can do that too. I don't know why you'd want to look as though you just dunked your junk in ice water, but hey, I'm not here to judge. Everyone's into something, and the corporate overlords within the Cyberpunk 2077 universe are more than happy to satisfy your every cosmetic desire. So yeah, the character creation interface overall definitely is a bit shallow and lacking compared to what we as players would normally expect from an RPG game, but it still does the job adequately enough. After creating your character, you're brought to your typical RPG skill point attribution menu, where you get to tweak your character's initial skill stats by spending a few skill points. For this playthrough, I went for a fairly moderate, well-rounded build, upgrading all my skills from 3 to 4, except my body attribute, which I doubled from 3 to 6. I'm not going to go through each of the skill areas here, since I'll save that for the full review, but if I had to pick one that was arguably more important than any of the rest, it is the body skill. Upgrading your body level increases your max health, increases your max stamina, increases the damage you deal using your fists and nearly all melee weapons, and allows you to force open doors with brute strength. Basically, this is the skill area you want to focus on if you want to effectively transform yourself into a human tank, demigod of destruction. Kinda sounds pretty sexy when you think about it. That said, intelligence is a pretty vital skill set too. I suppose not only in Cyberpunk, but also in the real world. Intelligence upgrades increase your hacking effectiveness, and since you'll likely be spending a fair bit of time in this game hacking, it's been my experience that you shouldn't overlook this area either. As for the rest of the skills, it's really up to your own personal playstyle preferences, but it doesn't hurt to upgrade them all, at least up to level 6 or so over the course of the campaign, since there will be some areas you literally cannot access and side quests you cannot complete without the proper attribute level. I mean, you could try, but you're going to reach a point where you won't be able to open a certain door or get past a certain barrier without having that attribute level. And believe me, this game is no stranger to soft caps in terms of its quests. The first 2.5 hours of the game is a fairly slow burn. I would say the developers mainly use this initial time as kind of an excessive but well-assembled series of tutorials, alternating between cutscenes, tutorials, action face-offs, choice-based conversation interactions, and the occasional driving sequences. There's just enough time in between each tutorial that you don't feel like you're stuck in an endless loop of them. And more importantly, the initial slow burn of this game's story during these earlier areas helps, in that when a tutorial appears, you don't feel like it's potentially taking you away from something far more interesting happening on screen in front of you. Also, there's the best bit being that you can just choose to skip through playing most, if not all, of the tutorials entirely if you want to. Personally, I played through most of them just out of interest. They were fine, nothing particularly noteworthy, just your bog standard tutorial nonsense. If you're expecting Cyberpunk to exceed and prove interesting in all areas, including its tutorials, you're really overselling the state of the game. Still, I got myself a Steam achievement or two for doing them, so I don't fully regret the experience. It seems like a fair amount of the game involves you doing various errands for different faction leaders. Inevitably though, as you work for different ones, they may ultimately ask you to betray one or more of your other contacts, in return for a higher payout for you personally and better long-term possibilities. This in a way feels like a reverse version of the mechanic we saw in the third Mafia game, where you designate one of your newly taken over territories or rackets goes to who. This time, instead of it being you who makes the offer, you're the one receiving it. There are some points when it might really be worth the risk to double-cross one of your old contacts, and other points where it might not. So far though, I've tried staying as neutral as the game will let me be. Driving in this game feels really clunky and obtrusive. You can really tell that while CDProjektRed have a lot of experience when it comes to building mostly satisfying combat systems and RPG mechanics, they're definitely somewhat of a newcomer to the driving simulation genre. Many of the cars you'll find in the world don't control all that great, and in some cases, it makes sense. You're not going to exactly have the best control over your car if it's a fairly large van, but for your average 2 or 4 seat family car, it doesn't make sense why it controls about as well as a Humvee. One thing I'll give the developers credit for here is that you can drive in either third-person or first-person mode. I quite like this, as while I prefer shooting and navigating around the world on foot in first-person, driving just feels far more conducive to a third-person perspective for me. There's just so much within the world to be aware of that the third-person camera feels not only useful but often vital at times. Now, you'll be spending some brief portions of the game engaging in gang shootouts on the road, because inevitably in the world of Cyberpunk, some faction will always want you dead for one reason or another. Combat in cars, to put it bluntly, feels okay but unremarkable, overall resembling a somewhat less enjoyable and less satisfying version of fighting on ground in person. I don't love it, but don't hate it either. Activities have what we might think of as an unofficial power level soft caps. If your weapon or melee damage isn't on par with your enemies, prepare for an insufferably slow combat sequence. I did one side mission where I had to take out a psycho-drugged enemy. Trust me, you're going to see a lot of these types of missions if you're doing any side content. It was the kind of mini mission that is supposed to be over in less than 2 minutes. Our battle ended up taking up over 10 minutes, or it felt like it anyway. I went through like 10 health refills in that span of time. Not to mention all the ammo from my primary weapon, secondary weapon, and even my pistol. All gone. And at that point, even after firing all my ammo into him, enemies still had half their health left. I had to literally chip away at their health with quick melee attacks bit by bit, in order to eventually take him down, which felt completely ridiculous. This game, as I hinted at earlier, has a lot of upgrades, which is cool, but the way in which it allows the player to access them leaves me rather mixed on the entire prospect. On one hand, it's very immersive. On the other hand, it's counterintuitive, and I would argue is even something of a time waster. And yes, I'm pretty sure it's at this point one or two of you might stop the video here to instantly begin writing a lengthy and explicit comment about how much you detest me for saying that, but hear me out. The actual upgrades themselves are pretty cool compared to the usual character upgrades that we've come to expect in any other RPG game, like really any Ubisoft game in the past 5 years. This isn't a criticism directed at the upgrades themselves, but in order to keep everything upgraded, you have to be constantly going back and forth between different specific vendors across the in-game world. I personally wish we as players had the option to bypass many of these vendor interactions and just upgrade ourselves. In the world of Cyberpunk, which in of itself is inherently futuristic, it's not like you have to strictly obey the conventional rules of realism. Instead of going to a vendor and spending 2 minutes installing a new body part, you're telling me you can't just order it and have the part sent to your in-game address instantly? Even Amazon now in 2020 can sometimes manage same-day delivery. I would hope that by the time 2077 rolls around, they'd have their delivery process perfected to a fine art. As for software upgrades, again, can't you do all that exclusively internally if you want to? I'm not arguing you have to take any of these features away and strip them out of the game. What I would have liked to see instead is an alternate option for those that don't overly care about the constant, never-ending immersion. I care about immersion myself, but after my third or fourth time getting a body upgrade, I can easily say I don't look forward to going through the same interactive process again and again and again and again for the rest of the bloody time I play this game. Despite being delayed multiple times to the point of almost being an industry-wide joke this year, this game is nowhere near as polished as I'd hoped it be. Sure, from an optimization perspective, hats off to CDProjektRed. It runs pretty smoothly for the most part. I will note here that there are still some fairly frequent occasions where the game will dip well below 60 FPS, but at least it didn't usually get to the point where the game was actually producing screen tearing. I only noticed maybe 1 or 2 instances of that while playing, but there are a lot more general game world related bugs. Many instances of NPCs walking through cars and other solid objects like they aren't there. I experienced one instance where hostile NPCs had detected me 2 floors below me on a staircase and would literally stand there firing through the stairs above their heads, the floor between them and me, since I was on the 3rd floor and they were on the 1st. While that was easily the most egregious case I noticed, there are many other cases where either NPCs wouldn't notice me when they should have, like if I went into a crouch a few feet away from them, or times when they detect me when I was nowhere within sight of them, and there is no evidence of my presence, like bodies or anything to tip them off. I think it goes without saying to a certain degree that open world games, particularly those made within what we would commonly refer to as the AAA gaming industry, have a tendency to be a bit buggy when it comes to how AI operates within the world. With most AAA games, these can be forgiven to a certain point, since most AAA games have a very narrow time window from the time they enter development to the time they ultimately go gold, aka finish development and prepare for distribution on both physical and digital platforms. However, we're not talking about a normal AAA game. Cyberpunk wasn't just given the usual 2 or 3 years of development time, which I would quantify as being your average AAA game development cycle. Cyberpunk 2077 was given roughly a full 9 years of development. We're talking about a game that has effectively been in the oven for more or less a decade. So I would think it goes without saying that the quality assurance standards for a game that was worked on for this long would correspondingly be much higher, comparatively speaking. And I haven't even yet talked about some of the many game-breaking bugs. I'm running this game off of a pretty beefy Windows 10 custom gaming desktop. I've got my NVIDIA 2070 GTX graphics card, 16 gigs of RAM, a 500GB SSD drive, a 1TB internal hard drive, and a 6TB external hard drive. Before even launching this game for the first time, I also installed the NVIDIA software update, which added day 1 support for Cyberpunk. I also, by default, allow game updates to download and install whenever Steam's open, and I'm not actively playing a game. So I should be fully up to date on all Cyberpunk 2077 bug fix patches. However, despite all of this, the game is still in a pretty mediocre state. I would say on average, I experienced usually 1 game-breaking crash per hour, and many more performance drops and other non-game-breaking bugs. Overall, what's my initial takeaway so far? Cyberpunk 2077 definitely can at times be an entertaining spectacle, but it's definitely not what I'd call Game of the Year material, not even close. While its bugs and technical mishaps don't do much to help its overall image, these are not the game's principal shortcomings. Let me be clear on that. They are not the principal shortcomings, but rather a combat system that feels excessively grindy and a loot system that often gives you multiple identical weapons with only slight statistical variation, and various enemy factions that, despite how the game's cinematics and promotional material pre-release tried to differentiate them all, still manage in-game to feel like you're generic and forgettable street thugs. Not at all that different than the gangs and thug groups we've seen time and again in other open-world games like Batman Arkham City, Mad Max, or really name your open-world game, because trust me, their gangs and goons are probably more or less the same as these ones. I don't want to make it sound like I hate this game, because I don't. In truth, I really don't. I've quite enjoyed my time here in Cyberpunk, and have even gone out of my way to play through and complete a lot of side quests and open-world content that I normally would never even think about in nearly any other similar open-world game. But I do think it's very fair to say that the 10s out of 10s and 95s out of 100s we've been seeing on popular stream game review sites are, as always, greatly exaggerated and very undeserved. Maybe Cyberpunk will redeem itself for me in its second half, but right now it seems like another quite good but not great AAA open world action game. If you love this game, by all means love it. I'm not saying you don't have to love it. I'm not saying I hate it. To me, it's a game that hopefully over the course of the second half will get a lot better, but I am definitely a little bit disappointed. The state of this game, as previously marketed by CDProjektRed, does not meet the same quality standards that we've been seeing at launch. Maybe over the course of the next few weeks and months, Cyberpunk will slowly transform into the game it should have been at launch. But I don't know, I'm seeing this personally as not all that different from being basically Marvel's Avengers 2.0. But at any rate, that's where I'm going to wrap up this video for today. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button, as that'll help other people discover this video and help this channel to grow. And if you want to see other first impression and game review content from me in the future, such as my inevitable Cyberpunk 2077 full review coming probably early next week, consider subscribing down below and clicking the bell icon to opt into getting notifications so you can be among the first to know when my next video goes live. I know a lot of you who watch my videos aren't subscribed, and I do appreciate your support. But YouTube's automated algorithms do make it pretty hard at times for people to discover my content if they're not already part of my community. Subscribing at the least does help alleviate that concern a little bit. Let me know what you think of Cyberpunk 2077. What's your opinion on it? What would you like me to go into more detail on when I put out my full review video on it? I'm already outlining various notes and observations for that video now, some of which I've not gone into detail on here in this video. So if there's anything specific you want me to address and discuss, I'm open to feedback there. This is WarriorDan signing out. Stay awesome, everybody. Stay safe, and peace out.